are monsters that hide in plain sight, wearing the faces of charming men who promise you the world right before they lock you in a cage. Jessica thought she was completely alone, trapped in an inescapable nightmare. But her abuser made one fatal mistake. He underestimated who was watching. To the outside world, Bradley Lawson was a catch. He was a successful regional manager for a logistics firm, drove a spotless silver Mercedes, and had a smile that could disarm a judge. When he first walked into Jessica Miller's life, she felt like she had won the lottery. Jessica was 26, working 2 jobs to pay off her student loans, and carrying the exhaustion of a woman who had been fighting the current her entire life. Brad swept in like a lifeline. He paid for dinners, bought her flowers just because, and listened to her dreams with an intensity that felt like love. But cages are rarely built overnight. They're constructed wire by wire, apology by apology. Within a year, they had moved together to Barstow, a desert town in California that served as a major artery for freight and travelers heading to Vegas. Brad insisted it was for his job, a promotion that would secure their future. He also insisted that Jessica didn't need to work so hard anymore. "Let me take care of you," he had said, stroking her hair. "Nah, you deserve to rest." Slowly, the isolation began. Brad didn't like her college friends. They were bad influences who didn't respect their relationship. He found reasons to start arguments right before she was supposed to visit her family in Oregon, ensuring she stayed home in tears instead. Before she fully understood what was happening, Jessica was marooned in a spacious, lonely house in the desert, her entire existence tethered to Brad's shifting moods. The charm evaporated, replaced by a suffocating control. Brad monitored her phone, scrutinized her grocery receipts, and tracked the mileage on her car. The psychological abuse eventually gave way to the physical. It started with a hard grip on her wrist, then a shove against the kitchen counter. Each escalation was followed by a flood of tears from Brad, dramatic apologies, and promises that the stress of his job was just getting to him. He swore it would never happen again. It always did. Desperate for a sliver of independence and a reason to leave the house, Jessica fought for months to get a part-time job. Brad finally relented, allowing her to take morning shifts as a waitress at the Rusty Diner, an old-school diner stationed off Route 66. It was close to home, and Brad figured he could easily keep an eye on her there. The Rusty Diner was a sanctuary wrapped in peeling vinyl and the smell of burnt coffee. It was also a frequent stop for the local charter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. To most of the locals, the sight of a dozen Harley-Davidsons lined up outside, gleaming under the harsh desert sun, was a cue to eat quickly and leave. The men who rode them were massive, clad in heavy denim and leather, adorned with the iconic death head patch that commanded instant, nervous respect. But to Jessica, they were just her Tuesday and Thursday regulars. She treated them the way she treated everyone else, with a soft smile, quick service, and genuine courtesy. One of the senior members was a towering, grizzled man named Nico Vandermeer, known to everyone as Dutch. He was a man carved from granite, with a thick silver beard, heavily tattooed arms, and cold, calculating blue eyes. He usually sat in the corner booth facing the door, flanked by younger members like Coyle and Iron Mike. Dutch always ordered his coffee black with a slice of cherry pie. Jessica made sure the coffee was fresh and the pie was warmed exactly the way he liked it. Dutch wasn't a man of many words, but he was observant. He noticed things that others didn't. He noticed how Jessica flinched when a tray was dropped in the kitchen. He noticed the heavy foundation she used around her jawline to cover the yellowing shadow of a bruise. He noticed that during the harsh Barstow summers, when the temperature routinely hit over 100 degrees, Jessica was the only waitress wearing long-sleeved flannel shirts beneath her apron. One stifling Tuesday morning in August, Brad decided to pay a surprise visit to the diner. He sat at the counter, his eyes tracking Jessica's every move, his jaw tight. When Jessica accidentally gave the wrong change to a trucker, Brad stood up, grabbed her arm hard enough to leave indentations, and pulled her into the narrow hallway near the restrooms. He hissed venomous insults into her ear, his fingers digging into her flesh, terrifying her so much she could barely breathe. When Jessica emerged 10 minutes later, her eyes were red-rimmed and her hands were shaking. Brad tossed a 20 on the counter and walked out, his silver Mercedes roaring out of the parking lot. Jessica walked over to the corner booth with a fresh pot of coffee, trying to steady her breathing. She poured the dark liquid into Dutch's mug. The heavy biker didn't look at the coffee. His icy blue eyes were fixed directly on her face. He looked at her trembling hands, then at the fresh red marks blooming on her forearm where her sleeve had slightly written up. "Everything okay, Jess?" Dutch asked. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the usual diner small talk. Jessica swallowed hard, forcing a fake, practiced smile. "Just clumsy today, Dutch," burning the candle at both ends. Dutch didn't push. He knew a captive when he saw one. He took a slow sip of his coffee. When he and the rest of the club got up to leave, Dutch left his usual generous tip on the table. But tucked beneath the sugar dispenser was a heavy, matte black business card. It had the Hells Angels insignia on the front. On the back, written in thick black ink, was a phone number and 2 words. "Any time." Jessica quickly slipped the card into her apron pocket, her heart pounding. She didn't know it then, but that small piece of cardstock was about to become the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave in the Mojave Desert. The illusion of safety shattered completely on a dry, windless night in November. Brad had come home from a corporate dinner, smelling faintly of expensive scotch and carrying a dark, simmering rage. He couldn't find his favorite watch, a luxury timepiece he claimed to have left on the nightstand. In reality, it was at the jeweler being cleaned, a fact Jessica had reminded him of that morning. But Brad wasn't looking for his watch. He was looking for a reason. "You're doing this on purpose," he slurred, pacing the living room hardwood. "You move my things. You try to make me feel crazy." "Brad, please," Jessica pleaded, backing slowly toward the hallway. "I told you. It's at the shop. I have the receipt right here." The mention of the receipt seemed to snap whatever fragile restraint he had left. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides. The slap was so sudden and violent that Jessica didn't even process the pain until she was already on the floor, the metallic taste of blood filling her mouth. This time was different. The performative apologies were gone. The remorse was absent. As Brad stood over her, his eyes were completely dead, devoid of anything resembling humanity. He reached down, grabbing her by the hair, and dragged her toward the kitchen. He threw her against the heavy oak dining table, his hands wrapping tightly around her throat. "I own you," he whispered, the smell of alcohol hot against her face as the edges of her vision began to darken. "If you ever think about leaving, I will bury you where no one will ever find you." In a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Jessica reached blindly behind her, her fingers closing around a heavy glass vase. With everything she had left, she smashed it against the side of his head. Brad roared in pain, dropping her as he stumbled backward, clutching his bleeding temple. Jessica didn't hesitate. She scrambled up, sprinting down the hall and locking herself inside the master bathroom. She shoved the heavy laundry hamper against the door, just as Brad threw his weight against the other side. The wood splintered. Hands shaking violently, she grabbed her phone from her pocket and dialed 911. She sobbed quietly into the receiver, begging them to hurry. 30 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the desert brush outside their windows. Jessica cautiously unlocked the bathroom door when she heard the heavy footsteps of law enforcement. But what she walked out to see made her blood run cold. Brad was sitting on the living room sofa, holding a bloody towel to his head, looking like a battered saint. He was calmly talking to Officer Gable, a local cop who occasionally golfed with Brad's boss. "She just snapped, officer," Brad was saying, his voice a perfect pitch of sorrow and confusion. "I told her I was thinking about ending the relationship, and she just lost her mind. Hit me with a vase. Look at the place." Jessica tried to speak, tried to point out the dark bruises already forming on her neck, but Officer Gable just sighed. "Look, folks, it's late. We don't want to make an arrest tonight and ruin 2 lives over a domestic dispute. Brad, you want to press charges for the assault?" "No," Brad said softly, playing the merciful victim. "She needs help, not jail. I just want her to calm down." Officer Gable turned to Jessica, his expression stern. "Mom, I suggest you take a sleeping pill and cool off. If we have to come back out here tonight, someone is leaving in cuffs, and right now, he's the one bleeding." When the police cruisers pulled out of the driveway, the silence in the house was deafening. Brad walked over to the front door, locked the deadbolt, and pocketed the key. He then walked up to Jessica, getting so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. "No one is coming to save you, Jessica," he whispered. "You are entirely mine." He took her phone from her trembling hand and walked to the master bedroom, locking her out in the hallway. Jessica spent the night huddled on the floor of the laundry room, wide awake, staring into the darkness. She knew with absolute terrifying certainty that if she stayed another day, Brad would kill her. She had no car keys, no phone, no money, and the police had just handed her right back to her executioner. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the desert in hues of violent orange and red, Brad left for work. He assumed she was thoroughly broken. He locked the front door from the outside, taking her purse with him to ensure she couldn't run. But survival instincts are a powerful thing. Once she heard the low rumble of his Mercedes fade into the distance, Jessica moved. She squeezed through the tiny high window in the laundry room, scraping her ribs against the latch, and tumbled into the dusty side yard. She ran through the unforgiving desert heat, her lungs burning, until she reached a dilapidated Chevron gas station 2 miles down the highway. She burst into the convenience store, startling the teenage clerk behind the counter. "Please," Jessica gasped, pointing to the landline phone behind the register. "I need to make a call. Just one call." The clerk, seeing her bruised neck and panicked eyes, silently pushed the phone across the counter. Jessica didn't call her family. They were too far away to get to her in time. She didn't call the police. They had already proven whose side they were on. Her trembling fingers dug into the pocket of her jeans, pulling out the slightly wrinkled, matte black business card she had kept hidden for 3 months. She punched in the numbers. It rang twice. "Yeah?" The voice was low, gravelly. "Dutch." Jessica choked out, a sob finally breaking through her chest. "It's Jessica from the diner." There was a heavy pause on the line. The background noise of revving engines and clinking tools instantly went dead silent. "Where are you, Jess?" The tone wasn't just serious, it was a cold, commanded focus. "I'm at the Chevron on Route 15. Brad, he locked me in. He took my things. I need to get my clothes and my dog from the house before he comes back on his lunch break. I need to leave town, Dutch. But I'm so scared he'll come back while I'm there. I just need someone to stand at the door so I can pack a bag. Please, just one person." "Give me the address of the house," Dutch said. Jessica rattled off the address in the gated subdivision on the edge of town. "Sit tight at the gas station," Dutch instructed, his voice eerily calm. "Don't move, we're coming." "Thank you," she cried, relief washing over her. "Thank you, Dutch. I just need a little help." She hung up the phone and slumped against the counter, her legs finally giving out. She sat on the linoleum floor expecting maybe Dutch and another guy to pull up in a pickup truck in 20 minutes. She figured they'd help her break a window, grab her duffel bag, and maybe give her a ride to the bus station. She had no idea what she had just set into motion. 15 minutes later, Jessica felt it before she heard it. A low, rhythmic vibration traveled through the floorboards of the Chevron station. It felt like a minor earthquake. The teenage Clark dropped a box of candy bars and ran to the window, his jaw dropping. Jessica stood up, her legs trembling, and walked out through the glass doors. The horizon wasn't empty anymore. Coming down the two-lane desert highway was a massive, terrifying wave of chrome, black leather, and roaring V-twin engines. It wasn't one pickup truck. It wasn't just Dutch. It was the entire charter, and they had called in reinforcements. The roaring vibration in the floorboards of the Chevron station wasn't just a few motorcycles. It was a mechanical earthquake. As Jessica pushed through the glass doors, the scorching desert wind hit her face, but she barely registered the heat. Her eyes were locked on the horizon of Route 15. A wave of black leather, gleaming chrome, and matte paint was cresting the hill. They rode two abreast, an endless, disciplined column of outlaws that stretched for a quarter of a mile. The deafening, guttural roar of 350 Vis twin engines swallowed the desert, drowning out the wind, the passing semi-trucks, and the frantic heartbeat drumming in Jessica's ears. Leading the pack was Dutch, riding a massive, customized black road glide. Beside him was a man even larger, wearing the president rocker on his cuts, a fearsome, scarred veteran who went by the name Rex. As they pulled into the dirt lot of the Chevron, the bikes kept coming. They filled the parking lot. They lined the shoulders of the highway. They idled in the turn lanes. The air grew thick with the smell of exhaust, hot oil, and dust. The teenage Clark inside had completely abandoned the register, pressing his face against the glass in absolute awe. Dutch kicked his kickstand down and stepped off his bike. He didn't look like a customer at a diner anymore. He looked like a general commanding an army. He walked through the sea of idling motorcycles, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel, until he stood in front of Jessica. He took off his sunglasses, his icy blue eyes scanning the dark, finger-shaped bruises blooming violently across her throat. His jaw tightened into a granite block. "You're safe now, Jess," Dutch said, his low voice somehow cutting through the mechanical thunder. He gestured over his shoulder to a tough, sharp-eyed woman climbing off the back of another bike. "This is Chloe. She's going to ride with you in a chase truck we brought up from the rear. We're going to your house. You're going to pack your things, get your dog, and you're never coming back to Barstow." Tears streamed freely down Jessica's face, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "Dutch, I just asked for one person to stand by the door." A grim, humorless smile touched a corner of Dutch's mouth. "When you mess with a friend of the club, you don't get one person. You get the whole damn charter, and a few neighbors." Within minutes, Jessica was sitting in the passenger seat of an extended cab Ford F-250, driven by a heavily tattooed prospect named Tommy. Chloe sat in the back, handing Jessica a bottle of water and speaking in soft, grounding tones. As the truck pulled out onto the highway, it was instantly swallowed into the center of the massive biker convoy. The ride to Brad's gated subdivision took less than 10 minutes, but to Jessica, it felt like a surreal dream. When they reached the pristine, iron-wrought gates of Desert Springs Estates, the rent-a-cop security guard inside the booth stood up, his eyes bulging. He didn't ask for IDs. He didn't ask for a gate code. His trembling hand hit the override button so fast he nearly dropped his radio, keeping the gates wide open. The Hells Angels flooded the manicured streets. They parked on the pristine asphalt. They parked on the perfectly edged Bermuda grass lawns. and they completely blockaded Brad's driveway. 350 bikers shut off their engines in a staggered, rippling wave. The sudden silence that fell over the wealthy neighborhood was heavier and more terrifying than the noise had been. Curtains twitched in the neighboring houses. Cell phones were undoubtedly being dialed, but no one dared step outside. Dutch, Rex, and 6 other senior members escorted Jessica to the front door. "Kick it," Rex commanded quietly. A massive biker named Bear lifted a steel-toed boot and drove it right through the deadbolt. The expensive mahogany door splintered and flew open. "Go get your life back, honey," Chloe said, patting Jessica's shoulder. "Take your time. We ain't in a rush." Jessica walked into the house that had been her prison for nearly 2 years, but this time she wasn't terrified. She walked straight to the laundry room, unlatched the kennel, and pulled her golden retriever, Buster, into a desperate, sobbing hug. With Chloe's help, she grabbed 2 duffel bags, throwing in her clothes, her important documents, and the few mementos she had from before she met Brad. She was just zipping up the second bag in the master bedroom when a sudden, sharp whistle pierced the air outside. "Jess," Chloe said, looking out the second-story window, a predatory grin spreading across her face. "Looks like Loverboy decided to come home for lunch after all." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She moved to the window and looked down. Turning onto the street was Brad's spotless silver Mercedes. Brad Lawson was a man who lived for control. He orchestrated every detail of his life to project power, dominance, and unshakable confidence. But as his Mercedes rolled down his street, the foundation of his reality completely collapsed. His street was impassable. It was choked with hundreds of custom motorcycles. Hulking men in leather vests were sitting on his lawn, smoking cigarettes on his porch, and leaning against his mailbox. Brad slammed on the brakes, the tires of his Mercedes screeching against the asphalt. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized his chest. He threw the car into reverse, desperately intending to back out and flee, but it was too late. Before he could even turn the wheel, a dozen bikers had walked out into the street behind him, crossing their massive arms, completely blocking his exit. He was trapped. Dutch and Rex walked slowly down the driveway, approaching the driver's side of the car. Brad locked the doors, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold the steering wheel. He fumbled for his phone, frantically dialing the private cell number of Officer Gable, the cop who had laughed off Jessica's assault just hours before. Gable! Gable, you need to get to my house right now!" Brad screamed into the phone. "Psst. There's a gang here, hundreds of them. They're surrounding my car. I got a call about a disturbance." Gable stuttered over the line, sounding distinctly uneasy. Pulling onto your street now." Brad looked in his rearview mirror. Sure enough, a single Barstow police cruiser turned the corner. Relief washed over Brad. He was a wealthy taxpayer. The law was on his side. But then the twisted, harsh reality of the real world set in. Officer Gable pulled his cruiser up to the edge of the motorcycle blockade. He looked through his windshield at the sea of 350 Hell's Angels. He looked at Rex, who simply turned his head and stared dead-eyed at the squad car. Officer Gable didn't turn on his sirens. He didn't step out of his vehicle. Slowly, deliberately, Gable put the cruiser in reverse, backed around the corner, and drove away, abandoning Brad entirely. The phone line went dead. "Get out of the car, Bradley." Dutch's muffled voice came through the glass. He tapped the driver's side window with a heavy, silver-ringed fist. Tap, 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 tap. Brad sat frozen, whimpering, tears of sheer terror streaming down his face. The polished, charming corporate manager was gone. In his place was a sniveling, broken coward. Rex didn't have Dutch's patience. He pulled a heavy steel wrench from his back pocket and smashed it through the driver's side window. Glass exploded inward, showering Brad in sparkling shards. Brad shrieked, throwing his hands over his face as Rex reached in, unlocked the door, and hauled him out of the vehicle by his expensive silk tie. Rex threw Brad onto his own manicured lawn. Brad scrambled backward like a crab, hyperventilating as the massive circle of bikers tightened around him, a wall of denim, leather, and silent judgment. The front door of the house opened. The sea of bikers parted like the Red Sea. Jessica walked out. She carried her duffel bag over one shoulder and held Buster's leash in her other hand. She walked down the driveway, her head held high, stepping past the shattered glass of the Mercedes. Brad looked up at her from the grass, his face a mask of shock and pathetic desperation. "Jessica. Jess, please. Tell them to leave. Tell them I'm sorry." Jessica stopped. She looked down at the man who had choked her, manipulated her, and threatened to bury her in the desert. She didn't feel fear anymore. Looking at him now, surrounded by the reality of what real power looked like, she only felt pity. "You told me no one was coming to save me, Brad," Jessica said, her voice steady and echoing in the quiet street. "You were wrong." She didn't wait for his response. She walked past him, climbing into the passenger seat of the Ford F-250. Once Jessica was safe in the truck, Dutch crouched down in the grass, getting right in Brad's face. The smell of Brad's fear was pungent. A dark stain had spread across the front of his expensive suit pants. Dutch didn't yell. He didn't need to. He spoke in a whisper so cold it seemed to freeze the desert air. "Listen to me very carefully, Bradley," Dutch rumbled. "This town is ours. The highway you drive to work on is ours. The shadows outside your windows are ours. If you ever try to find her, if you ever call her, text her, or even breathe her name to a friend, we will know. We won't come in the daylight next time. And we won't leave you breathing." To cement the terror, Dutch pulled out a manila envelope and dropped it on Brad's chest. Brad opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were high-resolution photos of Brad's parents' house in Ohio, his sister's children playing at a park in Seattle, and a copy of his bank account routing numbers. It was a terrifying, undeniable message. "We know everything. You have nowhere to hide. Sell the house. Quit your job. Leave Barstow," Rex added, stepping over Brad. "If I see your face in this zip code after Friday, I'm burying you under the floorboards of our clubhouse." Dutch stood up. He didn't strike Brad. The psychological destruction was far more absolute than any physical beating could have been. Dutch raised a single hand in the air and gave a sharp, circular motion. Simultaneously, 350 motorcycle engines roared to life. The ground shook. Brad clamped his hands over his ears, sobbing into the grass as the massive convoy slowly turned around and rolled out of the subdivision. Jessica watched from the window of the F-250 as Brad Lawson disappeared into the distance, a pathetic, broken speck in the rearview mirror. As they hit the open highway heading north toward a fresh start and a safe haven, Jessica rolled down the window. The hot desert air rushed in, tangling her hair. She took her first deep, genuine breath in 2 years. She wasn't invisible anymore, and she would never, ever be caged again. Survival isn't just about the strength to endure. Sometimes it's about having the courage to ask for help from the most unexpected places. Real monsters hide behind perfect smiles, but real protectors don't always wear shining armor. Sometimes they wear black leather. If Jessica's incredible story of survival gave you chills, hit that like button, share this video to spread awareness about domestic abuse, and subscribe for more unforgettable true stories.